Tuesday. Hello, Tim.
Hi, Matt.
It's time for another edition of BlogChat. Hello, Internet. How are you? So I see Eunice is already there. Thank you for being our constant viewer, Eunice. We appreciate
Yay.
you. Tim did something amazing this week. He made a truly comprehensive and devoted video about HDR processing of urban night photography. I watched it and all of its 20 plus minutes of glory. And I come to this blog chat saying, we're on a video platform. Why shouldn't we just show the video? Because that's not live. So right here at the beginning, I'm going to say, if you're watching this after it happened, stop, pause, go to the link below, watch the video, and then come back, because this is going to be a Q&A about HDR for night photography. Because we wouldn't offend you by playing a video that you can watch on your own time. You're here to talk about HDR live. So I'm going to put it out there to all two of us that are watching right now, Eunice and myself. How about you ask us some questions? But to kick it off while other people are warming up their brains thinking about HDR for night photography, I have one for you, Tim.
Sure.
Do you remember the first HDR that you did?
Oh, wow. That's actually a really good question, Matt, because it has evolved so much. So I would say the first attempt at controlling contrast would have probably been in about 1994 or 3. And what I mean by that is that HDR is nothing more. Well, I shouldn't say nothing more. It's a lot more. But in basically what it is the ability to take a picture of a photo of a scene that contains more information than our sensor can capture in one shot. This, but this has been going on forever. So this is why Ansel Adams burned and dodged. This is why we use different dilutions of developer, and this is why I would paint chemicals painstakingly on negatives, and paint chemicals on prints to strip away and add in density and silver. And this was all to capture all of the detail that a scene presented that the film couldn't even capture. And the film, when we were doing this in at least Tri-X, you could get almost 17 stops if you used a water bath and you went through all the processes. So it basically had 17 stop range if you did everything exactly correct. So that was my big struggle. I mean, I literally used to take pieces of tracing paper and overlay it on the negative, and then take pencil and draw in areas that I wanted to hold back light. And so, and then put that, all registered into the enlarger and then make prints. And then this was after, again, water baths and, chemicals on the print. And so this has really been going on a really, really, really long time. And of course, long before I started. So my first HDR shot really was back then. But then Photoshop came around, and I realized that you could take two different photographs and blend them together in many different ways. You could do it simply by masking, but there was also something called a luminance mask that we used to use quite a bit. And that would have been closer to what we think of as HDR today. And then HDR came out, and it was just like, the visual equivalent of a sour ball. Everything was super contrasty, and it was just like gritty and, over processed and super saturated. And I just hated that look because it looked so false to me. And so that's when I started getting into it, and then wrote the Realistic HDR, the book, The Realistic HDR, to try to bring it back to the way our eyes see it, or more precisely the way old film would have seen it. So
when was that? When did that come out?
That's probably about 8 or 9 years ago now, I would imagine. I think it's now at a print. I think you can still find it on Amazon used, or there's an ebook that's also very, very similar, and that you can get at Peach Pit. And so, yeah, because I've always felt committed to creating these more realistic looks rather than this fantasy, just simply because that's my MO when it comes to photography. You know, I'd like to push it a little bit, but not too terribly much, you know, and everybody's got their lines in the sand, you know, so I won't add 13 giraffes to a herd of 9, but yeah, I will bump up the contrast or bring down the highlights or something. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's something I felt very strongly about for a very long time, and, you know, and still to this day. So it's been a long time, Matt. Yeah.
I had no idea that I was going to get such a thoughtful and deep answer to that, but I'm glad I learned more about you.
It was a great question. No, it really was. Yeah.
So basically forever. You've been doing HDR forever.
Since I started in photography.
Isn't that
since I started in photography? As a matter of fact, you know, if I can add to this, and sorry about the exuberance.
I mean, you're the star tonight, so yeah.
Oh,
go for it.
Am I the only one in this room? What happened here? So I remember pre-exposing slide film. And if I can remember how to do this now, it gave you an extra stop of latitude. And what you would do is you'd put it on double exposure. Gosh, I can barely remember it now, but you'd give it the slightest little bit of exposure on the first frame and then take your shot. And what that did was raised up the
exposure floor or something.
Like, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like so flashing the film.
It's exactly correct. Exactly correct. And so, yeah, so I remember doing that, you know, back in the.
Okay. All right, since we're starting to bore the digital photographers, let's move to the present. No, I'm not saying, like, we got a legit question. I mean, I have a bunch of them in my head, but I saw a legit question come in from Eunice. Is it wise to use ND filters for HDR and long exposures?
You know, the fact of whether there's a neutral density filter in front of the camera or not really doesn't make any difference to the process. Now, that being said, there can be some problems over long exposure. So if you have, let's say, a tree blowing in the wind and the branches are blowing over a long exposure, then that could be problematic. Some of the ghosting algorithms can fix that, but if it's in motion the whole time, probably not. But that could happen from long exposure with or without an ND filter. So take the ND out of the equation, just knowing that it elongates your shutter speed, and just say to yourself, will a long exposure work, or will it have too much motion that will be hard to blend together between multiple exposures? That being said, I'll often shoot, you know, in the daytime, I'll shoot waterfalls and streams and things like that at 3 different exposures, and blending them together without any ghosting sometimes looks just fine. It looks a little different, but it's just another added benefit to, you know, an unexpected look that you could get. So yeah, so ND filters, no problem, as long as the movement is okay.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Good question, Eunice. You demoed using Lightroom in this latest video, but you mentioned that there's other pieces of software. You want to give us like a little survey of what kinds of software are available to do HDR and what their strengths and weaknesses are?
Sure. I would say the easiest and simplest and quickest is Adobe's, the one that's built into Adobe's Merge to HDR. Everybody's got that because we're all, you know, most of us are using Lightroom. It's the easiest to learn. That's what I demoed on the video. And it's just a matter of taking a series of shots at different exposures and really selecting them all and going into Lightroom and saying merge to HDR. And when you get in there, you click 1 or 2 buttons and it comes out and you're ready to go. And what you have then is a raw file. You have a DNG. So it's very, very malleable. The problem with Lightroom's HDR is their deghosting algorithm is not that great. And you know me, I love Adobe, but you know, I've got to call it as I see it. And I find it has a lot of problems when photographing. Like a perfect example would be, you may be in a forest in the middle of the day and there's lots of tiny little detail in the leaves in the background with white coming through behind it. And when you look at it at 1:1, you blow it up, there's just all kinds of artifacts that look completely fake. It's unusable. For basic, easy things with just hard corners and stuff, no problem. It's awesome. So I use Photomatix. Looks like my camera just went out of focus. There you go. I use a program called Photomatix, and that's the one that in the beginning, it was, I think it may have been the first one to come out. People abused it so horribly. Oh, it was just terrible what they did with it. And, you know, but it's got some really strong features to it that can make an image look really, really realistic. And that's why I use Photomatix. Now, there's some other ones out there that I'm unfamiliar with that I haven't used because I've been so happy with Photomatix that I've just never felt the need to find anything different. So was it Luminar or
Luminar?
Yeah, Luminars. Yeah, something like that. I've heard good things about that. I've never opened it. I've never tried it. So I think in this day and age, there's probably many choices that are certainly workable. I personally use a combination, or not combination, I use either Lightroom's Merge to HDR feature if I think it's a pretty straightforward and easy blend. And the moment it looks a little bit complex, I just go right to Photomatix. And then there's some other interesting things too about it. Like, for example, with Lightroom, you can't really pre-process the images. So a lot of times, you know, I may have 2 or 3 exposure. And even on the darkest one, maybe my highlights are a little bit bright. And maybe on the lightest one, maybe my shadows are a little bit dark. If I'm using Photomatix, I can lift those shadows up on the lightest image and darken those highlights down on the darkest image, then take those 3 into Photomatix, and it'll take those settings and blend them together. And it's a little easier to get a more realistic look to it that way. In Lightroom, you can't do that. So,
okay.
But
so
some people would argue that it's unnecessary, but
right.
You know, that's why.
I'm going to use the guitar analogy here. Mm-hmm. You're also a player, like a much better player than I am at this point. When you first want to play guitar, you get whatever guitar you can. You don't go out and buy a Gretsch or a Strat. You know, like you get the guitar that's handed down from your brother or somebody gave you, which happened to me when I was in Denmark. They're like, here's a guitar, and it was like a nylon string Spanish guitar, which I loved. Mm-hmm. But you play it until you hear the things that you don't want to hear, or you see the things don't work the way you want them to.
Exactly.
You develop the understanding of what nuance is for that application, and then you can make your decision about the next tool to use and choose a better tool.
That's a perfect analogy. It's absolutely correct, because some of the things I'm talking about would not even occur to people until they've been using it for a year or two, or, you know, and so that's absolute truth for sure. And that's why I highly recommend for people just starting in this, just to use the HDR program that they've got, and then move into it, you know, for sure.
Yeah. I agree with that completely. I say for software and gear and lots of things, use what you have first until it don't work.
Yeah.
And then invest a little more or change.
Yeah. Except for tripods, right? Anything that touches the ground. Start off good on that tripod.
Not mattresses, not shoes, not tires, not tripods. Yeah.
I love that. That's such a good thing you've got.
We had a good comment from Ed Finn.
Oh, hey, Ed.
Hi, Ed. How you doing? He said, I can do HDR in camera.
Yes.
Could I do multiple in cameras and extend range by doing HDR again in Lightroom?
Yes, but it wouldn't really be necessary. It's a cool idea, but when you're doing it in camera, you don't have quite as much control over it, and so and you typically get back a JPEG. They may now have changed that, but in the past they would do all the onboard processing and turn it into a JPEG automatically. So you could certainly extend the range when you got back into Lightroom. The only problem is you'd be extending the range on a JPEG rather than a RAW file. Now, if somebody out there could call me out and say, no, wait, my camera shoots HDR and I do get back a DNG, because I've heard talk about that. I'm just not sure where that's landed yet. Then that's a different story. But the fact of the matter is that whatever's happening is still being processed by the camera without your control. And your control is so incredibly important because you're making the tonal decisions. And that's super important. So I would always recommend, I'd always recommend shooting your own exposures and then blending them together later, especially with Lightroom, because it's so simple and so fast. Yeah, for sure.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. The thing about it is, and I know you can appreciate this, is that every situation is so incredibly different, and there's not a one size fits all, with exposure or with adjustments. So you could be photographing, a 6-stop bracket in the deepest canyons in the Southwest, or you could be doing a 2-stop bracket, 2 shots, in the city at dusk. And each one of those is going to have subtly different tonal ranges in the way we have to bring out their values in Lightroom to get what we want. And so it's really not a one size fits all. And that's what will happen, if you let the camera process it. So
Ed says his Pentax K1 does deliver a raw file from each.
Awesome. I thought that might be the case.
Yep.
I thought that might be the case.
Yep.
So thank you, Ed, for telling me that.
Katrina commented this. Great video, Tim.
Thank you, Katrina.
Appreciated the edit demos, and sad to learn that bracketing and pray isn't a valid option.
Yeah, not so good. And it will work from time to time, and you'll nail it. The thing about it is, and I learned this early on, is that let's see, how long do I want to go into this explanation? But basically, before Lightroom was doing their onboard, or before they were doing merge to HDR, in order to get Photomatix to look realistic, it was super important to feed into the program the exact right exposures. So what I mean by that is the window for a realistic image was much more narrow. If you wanted to take an image and just make it super crazy cartoon-like, you could do that because it was such a powerful program. But to keep it realistic, it was a much narrower window. So by feeding it the correct exposures, that was your solution for success. So I learned very early on to take the exact right exposures out in the field and ensure that I got those. Then when I came home, I knew what I'd be able to do. It'd be easy. So that's been a part of my process for a very long time. And just to make a long story longer, what you really want to do is ensure that you get your highlights, the exposure correct for your highlights. So let's say we're photographing, like in the video, like in the cathedral, so dim light situation. I want to see detail in the window panes of the stained glass in the cathedral. Okay, well, I don't need that to be at a mid-tone. You know what I'm saying? And you know what I'm saying, Matt, right? You can take that stained glass and you can make it like a middle tone color, or you can make it bright and luminous with some detail in it. And that's about the exposure that you want. Yeah. Because if you force that exposure to be darker, then you're feeding the program an unnecessarily dark image. And same way with the shadows, if you brighten up the shadows so bright, then what you're doing is you're feeding all these images in, and it just makes it harder for the program to work. So what I'll do is I'll literally just take an exposure these days now and look at the histogram and make sure that it comes right down into the corner. And now I know my highlights are good. Then I'll take a series of other shots, keep opening up on my shutter speed, not my aperture, until my shadows come right down into the corner. Then I know that's good. And then I just look at those two exposures. And if this one is a 30th and this one is 1/250th, I know I have to shoot a 30th, a 60th, a 1/125th, and 1/250th. That's 4 shots. I don't need 5. I can't use 3. I need 4. So you want to know exactly which exposures you need and then set your auto bracketing to capture that. So in that case, I would set it to an auto bracket of 5 and then just delete the image that I didn't need. And that's especially important when you're hand holding too, because you don't want to be, looking and taking exposure and looking. So in that case, once I realized it was, 30th, the 60th, 1/125th, and 2/50th, I'd set my camera to make sure that it was going to encompass those exposures, then put it onto a high frame rate and put it in auto bracket and set it up and get ready and then just go click, 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 click. And then you're feeding the program images that are much easier to register with one another rather than being all over the place.
Right.
So these are good habits that allow you to do things that you wouldn't normally be able to do.
Have you ever, do you find the need to use Photoshop's auto align prior to running an HDR set, or is it part of the process?
It is part of the process, both in Lightroom's HDR and in Photomatix, and I'm sure all of the other programs as well. But what I do get a kick out of Matt is there's always a checkbox that says align images. I'm thinking, of course, align images. Why wouldn't you? Why is that even an option? There must be a good reason.
Yeah, people like blurry. I don't know.
Yeah, I go.
I have a comment and then I have a question.
Okay.
Sandra says, National Parks Patch Lady, hello. Luminaire is interesting, lots of presets, but allows you to edit well. Last time I checked, exporting was a bit of an issue working with Lightroom.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and the thing is those presets can be dangerous. I always urge people not to use the presets, just simply because it's, and I hate to say it like this, but it's one-click art. It's one-click art, and so Photomatix has got a ton of presets too. And I would always ask people, well, which sliders did you use or something? And it could be the same. And is it Luminar?
Luminaire, I believe.
Luminaire. Same thing there. There's sliders that you can manually set, but if you use the preset and you say, hey, well, which slider did you put in too much, foundation or too much exposure, whatever, and the people don't know. I'm like, well, it's kind of hard to go back and fix if we can't determine what you've done. And so those presets are just that sort of that one click, and it gives you something, and then you may or may not like it, or you may not be able to replicate it or fix it. Now, the one thing the presets are awesome at is clicking on them and then seeing how it's moved the sliders off their zero indent. That's going to teach you a lot. And so I highly recommend doing that. So yeah, it's a bummer to hear about exporting it through Lightroom is difficult, because I know with Lightroom, of course, once you hit merge, it's only go through that process again for the folks that may have missed in the beginning. In Lightroom, you're in Lightroom, you pick the 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 images you want, select them all, go to Photo, Merge to HDR. Basically, you just click 1 or 2 buttons and hit merge, and it just pops back into Lightroom, and there it is, and you're working with your regular Lightroom sliders and tools. So it's very easy in and out to use Lightroom. Photomatix is also relatively simple. What happens there is you select the images and you choose, it's not up on my screen right now, but I think it's merged to, let's see, what is that command here? It's
Control Alt Delete.
Yeah, it's in a weird spot. So it's File, Plugin, Extras, and that's where you go to Photomatix, and I believe that's actually how you get to Luminar as well. And then it goes into Photomatix, and once you hit save, it automatically comes back into Lightroom. Now, there is one issue that I'd like to warn people about if you've not tried this before, and that is in Lightroom, a lot of times what people will do is they'll download their images from the start, right from a shoot. And at that point, you're actually in a place called recent imports, right? Is that what they call it? Previous import. And if you take your images right from there into, say, Photomatix, it may take that image that's been now merged and put it back into the folder that it actually lives in. But what you're looking at is you're looking at recent imports. And so you're like, where's the image? It's disappeared. And so you actually have to go to the actual folder in which it lives. And you can simply do that by clicking on any of the sources and source images and right click on that image and choose, what is it called? Go to folder in library. And when you do that, it'll take you right into that folder, and there will be your merged HDR that has just come back from that program. So I've seen a lot of that happen. People don't know where their HDR image was because they're in there. So start in the folder that the images actually live in. Yeah.
Now here's my question.
Sure.
What is the longest bracket of exposures you've done, since this applies to night photography?
Yeah, the longest one was actually not even at night, believe it or not. The longest one was in a really, really deep area in Antelope Canyon in the daytime. And I think I shot 7 images, 7 brackets at one stop apart to get the whole scene. It went from like 30 seconds down to, God, I don't even know, like half second or something, whatever it was, to get the brightest light down to the darkest dark. At night, it's actually a little bit easier. It's usually only about three stops, either one stop apart, or I'm sorry, 3 frames, either one stop apart or 2 stops apart. Most of the time we'll capture that. Yeah. And so, a lot of times what I'll do is we'll shoot those shots before it gets completely dark, to have that little bit of blue in the sky, but have it be somewhat darker, but have illumination. Maybe it's a city lights or light painting or whatever on the foreground, and merge those together, and then save that merged image of 3, and then shoot the nighttime shot or whatever it might be. It might be more light painting, or it might be star trails, or it might be, Milky Way or something, and then overlay those.
Okay.
So
we've got this bracket stack. You ever do focus stacking and HDR? I just had to ask.
Yeah, I have not.
Okay.
I have not, only because I tend to shoot such wide angle, Matt, that, at like 14 or 15 millimeters, there's really not a lot of reason to focus stack, unless you're, half a foot from your subject. But yes, it's certainly doable. I've done it with panoramas. So Lightroom now has a feature called merge to HDR and panorama. What is it called here? Photo merge, HDR panorama. So what I've done in the past is, and I think I did this actually in Bryce, where I was doing a Milky Way panorama, and bracket, 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 and you go across, because I was kind of control some distant lights and some foreground stuff out in the distance. And so, yeah, I've done it with that, but not with the focus stacking. But it certainly would work. Yeah.
That was going to be my next question, HDR and panorama. What have you not combined HDR with? That's what I want to know.
Portraiture. Oh, that's a lie. No, that's a lie. That's a lie. I've done that too. Yeah. Hey, man, when you got a hammer, everything is a nail. It's a
different analogy. When you're the guy who literally wrote the book on it,
well,
it might be something you're interested in. Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it really hit me when I was, young and first starting off, that it was such a difficult problem. And so when Photoshop and then eventually HDR came out, I just embraced it so hard, because I thought this is a thing we've been struggling with for, since the time of the first cameras. And so that's why I'm sort of so passionate about it,
Yeah.
And plus I also really like to shoot at times when there is too much, the dynamic range is just higher than our cameras can capture. Yep. It's the stuff that I'm drawn to.
Or perhaps we want our photographs to look more like what our eyes can resolve.
Absolutely.
That sounds unreasonable, right?
It really does. And I remember when, there was so much resistance, of course, to Photoshop and HDR when it first came out by the film photographers. And I remember saying, well, I know this sounds bizarre, but you actually have to take 3 different shots, blend them together to make it look like what your eye sees. Because if you just take a picture with your camera, it's not what your eye sees. The camera is fake. And this process that we're running it through brings it back to what we actually see. And it's kind of counterintuitive, but it is true. I think it said our eyes see 11 stops of latitude, which is a lot.
So I bet you at some point you got a tattoo that says HDR is truth.
You know, I've never thought of something true enough to put on my skin, but that one is, at least for now, until the next generation of cameras, you know, right?
Right. HDR is hyper truth. All right. We had Ed made a great comment. Great shots of the Gaudi Sagrada Familia. I can't say it.
Sagrada Familia.
Yeah.
It's an amazing place. It's a place that we go to on our Barcelona workshop, which we'll be hopefully still going to in November. And the place it's the most, if Antelope Canyon is the single most incredible thing that I've ever seen that nature created, which I have to say that it is, then these structures by Gaudi have to be the single most incredible structures that a man has designed out of his own mind. It's just mind-blowing. I don't know how many times I've been there, 5 or something, and you cannot see it all. It's mind-bending. It's mind-bending. And it's a photographer's dream, because you could just create designs out of what this mastermind put together. It's incredible.
Sold. I'm going.
Mind-blowing. Yeah.
Katrina said, great tips, Tim. I do shoot a lot of cathedrals, and thanks.
Oh, good. Yeah.
So what is the oddest thing that you've made an HDR of? That might take a while to think about.
Yeah, that might take a while to think about.
That's an unfair question.
Yeah, I'll tell you the most difficult thing, and you'd think it'd be the easiest, is, you know how, like, when you want to shoot a full moon as it rises above the horizon?
Yep.
And if you do it the day of the full moon, the sky's too dark. You do it the day before or 2 days before, and it's like, boom, you can nail it in one exposure.
Yeah.
When you're doing it the day of or the day after, the exposures land in just such a way that in order to bracket to get the moon detail and the detail in the foreground, because your eye can see it perfectly fine, you have to go just beyond the exposure that the moon is moving. And you always end up with the moon slightly moved. And it is one of the most difficult things in Photoshop, I think, to fix. I'd rather mask out some crazy flyaway hairs, the most difficult masking. And the moon is so hard because it's got this slight glow and a color variation from the edge to the center. And I dread it every time. I'm like, I need this shot. I've got to get it. It's the full moon over this beautiful thing. I've got to take it, but it's the wrong day. I'm like, oh man, I'm in for some work,
And,
so
and you're not going to pop on a different lens and take a different shot and Photoshop that in.
I could do that. The problem is it's still hard, because when you get the detail on the moon, the sky goes so dark.
Right.
And then there's this gradient from the moon to a very dark sky, and then overlaying that on a lighter sky. There's a lot of little issues. Yeah.
Well, maybe that star tracker that you're testing out, you can follow the moon.
Oh, I can't wait for that. I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah.
I really am.
Cat's out of the bag. So you mentioned your first book. You've written more than one book on this topic, haven't you?
Yes, I wrote the Realistic HDR, which was a paper book, and then I wrote what's the title of that one? It's not the Realistic HDR again.
The Realistic HDR Image.
That might be it. Yeah, it's an ebook, and it's God, I wrote it again about 6-8 years ago. So oddly enough, there it is, the Realistic HDR Image. Yeah, there we go. That's the ebook. Yeah.
Okay.
That's the one. Yeah. And that's,
yeah, this one right here.
Yeah. Yep. That's the one. Yeah. And that just takes you right to Peach Pit. And it's $8. Well worth. Best $8 you've ever spent.
Nice. Yep.
But it's interesting, and what I want to say here, Matt, is that clearly on that cover, you can see that it was a daytime photograph, but
right.
I've just been surprised at how much I use, HDR at night. Not all the time, of course, but yeah, enough that I'm glad that I know the technique, and then especially in low light, which kind of goes right along with our, I don't know about you, but I rarely go out after it's dark and just start shooting. I usually start right at sunset and shoot right on through.
Right.
And, in those times, right around sunset, HDR again is very necessary. So,
yeah. I'm glad that you love the technique so much and you're generous enough to share with us. So that's great. So I got another question from,
okay.
I want to come back and talk to you about the other book, but Martha said, so maybe you addressed this already, but why shoot an HDR in camera that converts to JPEG versus just bracketing and processing later?
Yep. And we did it. Is that Martha? Hi, Martha. The main reason, and we did actually go over this, but real quickly, the camera does the processing for you, and it does not allow for your own creativity, style, and the look that you want to apply to the image. And when you just bracket and process in HDR, you have full control, and each image is going to be a little bit different. Just like with your night photography, every image, you can't just put a workflow down and say, oh, if I put this up 6 points and this up 8 points, then it's going to look like what I want. And it's the same thing here. You're going to want to edit each individual image, each individual scene separately.
Yep. There was a good follow-up to that. And then you also don't recommend using a gradient filter, a graduated neutral density filter anymore, right? I remember your answer was why, if you can just go ahead and shoot an HDR.
Yeah, there's not much argument over that anymore. There was, of course, when HDR became popular, there was the people that wanted to stick with their filters. The bottom line is the biggest advantage to using a filter is that you get it all in one frame and you don't have to post-process. That's it. But there's a lot of downsides. Number one, you're putting more glass in front of your lens, which degrades the quality. Number two, you can't control the gradient. So, you can a little bit by opening up and stopping down your aperture to make it softer or harder gradient. However, if you've got a mountain peak coming up, the gradient is always going to darken the mountain peak and have the bottom of the mountain lighter, and that looks fake. So you can't really get a super realistic look with a graduated filter, because there's going to be situations that's going to darken things in the top of the frame where you don't want it. And many times with HDR, you may have, light spots, not just on the top of the frame like a sky, but you may have light spots all over that you want to control, and you can't do that with the filter. So there's many reasons not to use the filter. And with the deghosting in Photomatix, you could literally have a person walking through the scene, click, 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 have them in 3 different spots, and you just go in circle and say, this is the person that I want to be in the frame, and it just does it. So, yeah, so I haven't carried those filters around with me, I don't know, 10 years, something like that.
The only use case that I could really think of now would be for video.
Yes, absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely.
I think you have to manage your contrast as much as possible, even with raw video and log video. Like, you still need to manage your contrast no matter what, your dynamic range. So
yes, couldn't agree with you more. And I didn't throw my filters out. I just don't care.
They were expensive. So
yeah.
That was a good question, Martha. Okay, like before we get completely escapes me, that other book that you have is called Hdr Photography from Snapshots to Great Shots.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
That was the same publisher that did Gabe and I's book, on night photography. So it was the same series of books. And that, I would say, is just a little bit more in depth, Matt. That's the biggest difference.
Okay.
So they both cover all the same topics. They cover how to shoot, how to bracket, how to meter the scene, literally meter the scene properly with a spot meter and so on and so forth, into pardon me, into processing the images. The book we're looking at now just is a little bit deeper. It's a longer book and it's a little bit more extensive. But the ebook covers all the same information, just not quite as deep.
Okay, great.
Thank you for asking that.
I put a link in the live chat so people can go to our bookshelf, which was the page I was just showing. I think we talked about that very recently when we talked about our love and passion for night photography books. You'll find Tim's books and all the instructors' books right at the top of the page there, as well as many other amazing things that you can read and pore over and enjoy. Wow.
Truth.
Wow. I will also put these in the description of the YouTube video. So if you're not seeing the live chat, you can look for it in the description down below too. So I don't see any more questions right now. Do you have any? Do you have any like sort of wrap up thoughts about HDR and your passion for it and helping people achieve their dreams?
Yeah, you know, I would say that it's something worthwhile to practice for sure. And the reason that I believe that is because, Matt, you remember using spot meters and having to meter the scene and place things in the right area. What that did for us as photographers was not just get us a good exposure when it was necessary, when we were shooting transparency film and you can only be about a half stop off. But what it did was it taught us light. And the more that you metered the scenes, the more you understood light. And you could look at a scene and not only say, oh gosh, that one thing is 2 stops brighter than this other thing, or look at a scene and say that's not going to work because it's going to be beyond the ability of my film to capture. But it taught you composition. And you could say, well, gosh, you know, this is not going to look good given the way the tones are falling out. And so by practicing HDR and going through the whole metering process and finding out, you know, how many stops away the highlights are from the shadows and thinking about it and looking at light, just practicing that teaches you light in a way that's going to help your entire craft, not just getting the right exposure. And so I would say that's what I would definitely leave everybody with. Practice it, learn it. Don't, you know, like I said, you know, when you have a hammer, everything's a nail. You don't want to do that because not everything needs HDR, and it's, you know, you don't need to do it. But by practicing it, it will teach you a lot about your craft, and I do believe you'll make better images. Yeah,
I'm with you on that one, man. And I just want to say, I wanted to say this before, and I'm just going to add this as my parting thought. One of the things I've really enjoyed about teaching with you is that in this same vein of asking people to learn to see, to know their tools and to train their eyes, and that connecting those synapses is when you're processing and to not use those presets. That's one of the things I loved about teaching with you is like, you encourage people to understand what they do, why they do it, and when they do it, and learn how to see it.
Yeah.
And this is a process of connecting all of those dots and practicing over and over again, and then learning to see, and even going back to old images and saying, I can see differently now. I will process differently now.
Yeah. Because it's amazing how much it changes over time. Go look at your images 5 years ago, and you're going to want to reprocess them for sure.
Yes.
Or retake them.
Yes. Oh, okay. We had this beautiful wrap up, but we did get one more question from Ed.
Okay.
Why not change aperture instead of shutter speed on HDRs for the moon, especially?
Well, okay, so I'll start with first of all, Ed, you could do that, and it may not be a problem. The primary reason you don't change the aperture is because if you set your aperture so that everything is going to be sharp from front to back, changing your aperture is going to throw something out. And that's not what we want. We want all the same sharpness throughout. In the case where, you know, you've got some foreground that's relatively close to you, and let's say you need to shoot it at f11, if you open it up to, by the time you get to f4, something is going to be out of focus. If you're just like way off in the distance and that's all you've got, and you could shoot it at 5, 6, or 4 and 8 and still be in sharp focus, then yeah, go for it. You can do it, no problem. But I would argue this, another approach would be to actually bracket with your ISO in that case. So let's say the slowest exposure needed to be whatever, say 10 seconds, instead crank it up a couple of stops with your ISO. If you've got a camera that's shoots really quality images at higher ISOs, and knock that exposure down, and then you might be able to get them all when the moon is still in the same spot. So,
great question, and a great way to wrap this up. Right back to night photography and HDR. Love it. All right. Well, thank you to everyone who came to join us for the live stream. We appreciate you very much. Thank you for tuning in and participating. That's why we do this live. Otherwise, we could just record this, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Otherwise, you can visit the rest of our YouTube videos and see these scrupulously, deliciously created videos that Tim makes. His meticulous attention to detail and providing high quality education is something to be admired and enjoyed. So,
oh my goodness, Matt, jeez,
I love it, man. Your videos are just awesome. So
thanks, man. Appreciate it. Thanks everybody for coming. We appreciate y'all.
Yep. We will see you around. Join us on Wednesday nights on Instagram. It's National Parks at Night. We have great chats there with wonderful people.
Great one coming up.
Yeah, who is it? I got to check.
National Park Patch Lady.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
I hear she's famous. We really like her.
She's famous.
She's famous. So,
she's great.
Yeah. So tune in tomorrow night on Instagram. Join us for a lively conversation with awesome people. And we appreciate you guys. We miss you, and we hope to see you soon.
Yes, we'll see you all soon. Take care.